When Daniel Bigelow reached the northwest frontier in 1851, the land north of the Columbia River belonged to Oregon Territory, and the pioneer town of Olympia contained fewer than 200 people. By the time he died in 1905 at the age of 81, Washington was a full-fledged state and Olympia was its capital. In many ways, the story of Daniel Bigelow, his admirable wife Anne Elizabeth, and the house they built in 1854 on the wild shores of Puget Sound is the story of Washington itself.
I was born in the state of New York and educated in Boston, read law at Harvard, and earned my degree in 1850. And I packed my belongings and headed west, first to Indiana, then to Wisconsin, looking for a good place to settle down and practice law. It was while I was in Wisconsin that my eyes began to trouble me. I thought for a time I might go blind, and it gave me a sense of urgency about how I should spend my life. I'd heard a lot about the far west, and before long I'd made up my mind. On New Year's Day, 1851, I wrote this in my diary. I intend now to go to Oregon in the spring. I believe that there are now many reasons why Oregon must improve rapidly, and I wish to be there to see. So in March, I packed up my law books, my desk and my diary, and traveled across the plains by ox team, bound for the Oregon Territory. The books, the desk, and I arrived in Portland in October of 1851. Immediately I decided two things. First, that there were already too many lawyers in Portland. And second, that my future lay north of the wide Columbia, up in the Puget Sound country. I sailed out of Portland on the schooner Exact, along with a group of folks known as the Denny Party. They disembarked at a damp, lonely place they hopefully called New York. Today that place is the sprawling metropolis of Seattle. Back then it was nothing more than a single half-finished log cabin. I sailed on to Olympia, which was at least a real town, with a custom house and a post office too. By January, I was able to write in my diary, "Have, since my arrival, built me an office, and am at the present of the opinion that this is as good a location for me as is to be found in Oregon, although some more favorable point may spring up down the Sound. But the north of the Columbia, now and always." I signed a petition calling for a new county north of the Columbia, and in June I was elected treasurer of brand new Thurston County. That gave me a taste for politics that stayed with me all my life. On the 4th of July, 1852, I gave the most famous speech of my career. It was delivered in the first schoolhouse on Puget Sound, right here in Olympia, and it drew a crowd from all over the region. We wanted a separate territory of our own, distinct from Oregon. Some people say it was my impassioned oratory on that Independence Day that spurred the creation of Washington. We are now assembled on the verge of the United States soil. We see the flag of the Union waving over us, and we feel that beneath its ample folds, we are at home. Two monumental events took place in my life during 1854. In February, I was elected to the first council for Washington Territory, one of only 9 members of the first territorial legislature. And in June, I married Anne Elizabeth White, daughter of a pioneer family that had settled on Chambers Prairie. She was only 18 years old then, but she had driven an ox team across the plains from Wisconsin and had taught in a pioneer schoolhouse along the Nisqually River. This was the cabin to which I brought her, and it served as our home while I set to building the bigger house next door. But before long, we moved to the big White House, which was a provident thing, as over the next 30 years we filled it with 8 active children. We had a small farm on our land claim, too. We had horses. Elizabeth loved horses. Milk cows, chickens, and swine. We grew oats, hay, wheat, and potatoes, and had a fine fruit nursery, too. In fact, the place became known as the Bigelow Orchard. The gnarled apple and pear trees still bear fruit here now are some of the same trees I planted over 100 years ago. We were isolated here in those days. I traveled by canoe to my office downtown, but there were no easy overland roads. When the Indian troubles came in 1855, we were on our own. We built a blockhouse here in the front yard in case we should be attacked. One night near dusk, we saw 12 canoes filled with Indians, all heavily armed, coming towards us down the bay. The Indians landed and formed a line. The chief spoke emphatically in loud, piercing tones. The Indians all fired their guns, and we were paralyzed with fear. Then, to our surprise, they proceeded to stack their arms to be turned over to territorial authorities. They were a company of Indian scouts under Chief Pat Kanin, who had been fighting for, not against, the white settlers. It was a sad day indeed when Anne Elizabeth received word of the death of her father, killed out in Chambers Prairie during the Indian uprising. She galloped out there in the driving rain, clutching our infant son in her arms as soon as she heard the news. We'd been married only a couple of years. She was barely out of her teens. After her father was buried, her mother, brothers, and sisters came here to this house for safety. In general, though, we got along fine with the Indians. I hired many Indians to do work in and around this house. I guess I was about the most elected man in the territory. I served as prosecuting attorney, probate judge, territorial auditor, member of the legislature, postmaster, and superintendent of schools all at once. When one of my neighbors was asked to cast his ballot for another man, he stoutly refused. "I won't never vote for nobody else for nothing," he declared. There were 4 issues I fought for fiercely, both in and out of my office. The first and least popular was temperance. I firmly believed that liquor should be abolished in the territory in order that decency and morality should prevail. Great efforts were made by the liquor lobby to defeat me at the polls, but I managed to win anyway. My second great issue was education. I served on the first school board in Washington and was superintendent of Thurston County Schools many times. I stumped for a public high school for the city of Olympia long before one was built. In 1858, I helped found a college here in Olympia. 2 of my daughters, as well as my wife, attended this little college. It later moved to Tacoma and blossomed into the venerable University of Puget Sound. I was an outspoken advocate of what these days are called civil rights. One of my first tasks in the first territorial legislature was to ask my fellow members to pressure the U.S. Congress into permitting a fine mulatto man to own land here in Thurston County. This man, George Bush, was a hard-working, generous settler who was known for helping his neighbors, yet because he had Negro blood in his veins, he was prevented from owning land. The Territorial Council took action, and Congress agreed the following year to let Mr. Bush have his land. Both Anne Elizabeth and I were firm advocates of women's suffrage. And on October 14, 1871, I spoke in the Territorial House of Representatives, saying, "The natural rights of every human being are the same. As a matter of natural right, I know of no valid argument to deny franchise to women any more than to men." 2 days after I made that speech, the famous suffragist Susan B. Anthony came to call at our house. Miss Anthony was in Olympia to lobby the legislature on the subject of women's suffrage, and Anne Elizabeth and I naturally invited her to our home. Right here in this room, Miss Anthony and I discussed suffrage at length. Although we differed in some of our views, we worked together in drafting a constitution for the Washington Territory Women's Suffrage Association. Washington women won the right to vote in 1883, though they lost it again 5 years later. The fact that they won it at all at this time was due in part to my efforts. It was not until 1910 that women won the vote here for good. After the 1870s, I retired from most of my public duties. Oh, I continued working to improve education, but mostly I spent my later years practicing law, tending my land, and raising my large family. There's a tombstone in the cemetery up the hill that says I passed on in 1905. But look inside these walls that I built. In my orchard that still blooms in the spring, in the desk and the law books, the diary, the solemn sepia photographs that survive in this house where Bigelows have lived for 4 generations. And somehow, well, I'm still here.
Anne Elizabeth Bigelow lived on in the house until her death in 1926. Her daughters remained in the Bigelow House, where they were joined in 1935 by young Daniel Bigelow, the first Daniel Bigelow's grandson, and his wife, Mary Ann Campbell Bigelow. Daniel and Mary Ann still live in the house today. After 140 years, the house remains essentially as the first Daniel Bigelow built it, a testament to one man's faith in the future of Washington.